So welcome to everybody to Israel at the Crossroads of Anti-Semitism. Tonight we're going to have a time together to share a brief history of anti-Semitism and how you might deal with anti-Semitism or approach anti-Semitism in the real world. The course is, of course, designed for anybody to learn, to grow, but I think that in some ways, my intent is for this to be shared by all of you with people who are encountering anti-Semitism in their workplaces, in their schools, on the college campus. We'll be talking about BDS later on, and BDS is rearing its ugly head in the form of anti-Zionism, and we'll talk more about that later on. But as we get started, I just want us to have a conversation quickly about what anti-Semitism really means. How do we define this thing that we'll be talking about tonight? And when I talk about anti-Semitism, I'm talking about a specific definition that I want to share with you. So anti-Semitism refers to prejudice and or discrimination against Jews as individuals and as a group. Anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes and myths that target Jews as a people, our religious practices and our beliefs, and the Jewish state of Israel. The reason I wanted to begin with that is because often people confuse anti-Semitism to be more broad than that very unique and pointed definition. Because in many ways, if you ask what a Semite is, it is a person who is descended from the ancient Middle East. And that would include people who are of Arab descent, and people who are of biblical canonic descent, and not just Jews. But in today's modern conversation, the word anti-Semitism is specifically dealing with the Jewish people. At the bottom of the page here, you see it says, historically, what began as a conflict over religious beliefs evolved into a systematic policy of political, economic, and social isolation and exclusion and degradation, and eventually in the Holocaust, eventual attempted annihilation. Now, it didn't start with the Nazis, so it's nothing new. Anti-Semitism has been around for thousands of years. And so for us to really have a deep conversation about how anti-Semitism looks today in the world, it's important for us to go back in history and to see what anti-Semitism has looked like through a historical reality of time. So to do that, we have to go back to some biblical origins. The Bible presents us with the first known understanding of anti-Semitism as it came to play out in the biblical story. To do that, we're going to look at Abraham. Abraham, who was the father of all monotheistic religions. So that's Christianity, Islam, Judaism. He led his family from an unknown location to a place called Canaan, almost 1,000 years before the Common Era, where a new nation, Am Yisrael, came into being. Now, if you know the Midrashic story, you know that Abraham lived in his father's idol shop, and he rejected the idea of many gods and decided that for him, this first person with a relationship with a single God, Abraham was going to be connected to only one God and not a pantheon. Now, because of that, our ancestors experienced persecution because they didn't want to adopt what other religions were doing. They didn't want to worship the way other people were worshiping in the Middle East. In other words, worshiping a variety of gods. That was the custom at that time. And that refusal by Abraham to worship more than one singular God, and later the people of Israel to worship more than one singular God, actually was seen as very stubborn. It was resented by other peoples. And so if you look into the Bible accounts, you see many other people fight with the Jewish people or the early Hebrews about their decision to believe just in Yahweh, the single God. An example, the other prophets who were worshiping a god called Baal, or a series of gods called Baal, fought against Elijah at the mountain, which is now outside of modern-day Haifa, Mount Carmel, and Elijah defended a single God. But these other God worshipers believed that there was more than one God, a sun god, a moon god, a fertility god. And that created animosity between peoples, but it set us apart as the Jewish people, as monotheism. Now, over time, other religions come into play, and ultimately, Judaism has to play itself out against other religious identities. So, for example, Christianity. At first, it was just another Jewish sect, right? Jesus was, in fact, a Jew living in or around Jerusalem, and the disciples were Jewish. But in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Romans came into Jerusalem. They destroyed the Jewish state. They destroyed the temple, and Jews were then scattered all over the ancient world. And during those first few hundred years after the crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans, Jews and Christians were able to exist together, just two different religious identities coming into play and creating a unified way of living. Now, what's strange about the story is what happens next, because what happens next is the Roman emperors begin to convert to this new religion called Christianity, and Christianity becomes the only religion of the Roman Empire. The early church fathers established Christianity as the successor religion to Judaism. In other words, they couldn't coexist anymore. Christianity was the next best thing. And therefore, our refusal to accept Jesus as the Messiah was somehow a threat to the Roman rulers and to Christianity. And so it's at that time, at that moment, once Christianity becomes codified in the Roman Empire, that anti-Judaism becomes a serious thing. Now, there is, of course, this concept of deicide, and I want to just take a break here to talk about deicide. Deicide is this idea that we, the Jews, killed Jesus. First of all, let's talk about the timing. We're talking about 30 of the Common Era. So this is just after the turn of the millennia and before Christianity is declared the Roman Empire's official religion, some 270 years later. So this is before Christianity and Judaism are separated. Jesus is living in ancient Judea and living as a part of a Roman governorship. Now, Jesus was crucified sometime around 30 of the Common Era. And there was a man named Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea. And it was Pontius Pilate who was actually the judge presiding over the trial of Jesus and who ordered the crucifixion. Now, the Gospel of Matthew, which is written after that by the disciples or by others who named the book in the name of the disciple Matthew, actually creates a story that is very anti-Semitic and presents the Jewish people who were watching that trial as a bloodthirsty mob. Now, certainly, there were leaders in the Jewish community who didn't like Jesus. They thought that his teachings were subversive. They thought that maybe he was antithetical to the rabbinic personalities of the time. But in no way did the Jewish community see Jesus as a threat. And therefore, the idea that Jews actually asked for Pontius Pilate to kill Jesus is simply not in sync with history. But because of the Gospel of Matthew, because of this historic story, we begin to see Christianity and Judaism break apart. Now, there's one story I want you all to hear about. Maybe you've heard of this guy named Barabbas, and it's important to understand his name from a Hebrew contextual perspective. Bar Abbas, his last name, a man whose, by the way, first name was Jesus Barabbas, was a bad guy living at that time. Bar Abbas means son of the Father. Interesting. If Jesus is seen as the Son of God, who are we talking about? Jesus of Nazareth, the subversive, or Jesus Barabbas, the criminal? And according to all of the Gospels in Christian tradition, there was a Passover custom in Jerusalem that allowed the governor, Pontius Pilate, to commute one prisoner's death by popular acclaim. In other words, imagine the scene. It's just before Passover. Pontius Pilate comes out on a balcony overlooking the city. He brings two prisoners and he asks the crowd, who do you want to kill? Do you want to kill this man or do you want to kill this man? Because of course, killing at the crucifixion or at the cross was a way that the Roman government took care of seditionists, of people who were anti-government. So Pontius Pilate comes out onto the balcony, he brings two men. One's name is Jesus of Nazareth. One's name is Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus, son of the Father. And he asks the crowd. And according to the Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, those are the three Gospels that sort of tell the same story in different words, the crowds chose Barabbas to be released, this guy Jesus Barabbas, and Jesus of Nazareth to be crucified. This is how you get the very common thought that the Jews chanted, kill Jesus, kill Jesus, kill Jesus. They were choosing, according to the synoptic Gospels, that Jesus was the one they chose to be crucified as opposed to Jesus Barabbas. Now, we know for a fact that the story is fabricated by the gospel writers in order to make the Jews look like they are participating in deicide. Nonetheless, it sets up a long history of the Jews being accused of killing Jesus. And that Jew hatred continues through Europe and the Middle Ages in unbelievably challenging ways. These are troubling developments that happen over the course of Jewish history. Here are just a few of the examples. Jews were forbidden to marry Christians in 399 of the Common Era. Jews were prohibited from holding positions in governments. Jews were prevented from appearing as witnesses against Christians. And this is what I love. It was alleged that Jews had horns like the devil, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there was the blood libel that was devised by a man named Thomas of Monmouth of 1150, who explained the mysterious death of a Christian boy by suggesting that Jews needed his blood to create matzah. These and other terrible stories about Jews perpetuated this idea that Jews were somehow different, that Jews were somehow responsible for Jesus's death, that Jews were somehow other or disgusting or terrible examples of humanity. And these traditions continue to this day. Now, I want you to take a look at the screen right now and just check out the pictures on the left side of the screen. Each of these pictures depicts a very famous Jewish moment. The bottom, the statue, is Michelangelo's Moses at the mountain. The other two, Moses receiving the 10 commandments at the top of Mount Sinai. What you notice about the two on the left, the bottom and the left, are the horns on the head of the Moses figure. So this is somehow a feature that people ascribe to Jewish people. We have horns on our heads. But take a look at this picture of Moses with the light shining from the sky above him, his face aglow. This particular piece of art represents the reality that led to a misinterpretation of Hebrew that eventually becomes anti-Semitism as we know it. The Hebrew in the right side of the circle, Vayhi Baredet Moshe Mehar Sinai, when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, as Moses came down from the mountain bearing the two tablets of the pact, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant. He had spoken with God. So the picture depicts it beautifully, right? It's gorgeous imagery of sunlight shining from the Godhead down into Moses. Moses is glowing. But if you look over here at the Hebrew, where I'm circling with my cursor right now, I hope you can see that. The word in Hebrew is keren or panav. He had rays of light coming out of his head. Rays of light coming out of his head, which become misinterpreted as horns radiating. Why? Because the Hebrew word keren has a double meaning. It is both rays of light and horns. So he had horns or rays of light coming out of his head. And from this single verse, we get thousands of years of anti-Semitic tropes that Jews look like the devil. And then there's the blood libel, another horrific idea that comes out of Jewish history. Look at the picture on the right. It's a child being held up almost like Jesus, and he's being bloodlet. And the blood is not being drawn out to the ground to kill him. It's actually being collected in a vessel underneath him. And it starts with this idea that the Jews were responsible for the killing of Jesus on the cross, but we've already learned that that was the Roman Empire, Pontius Pilate. But that idea that Jesus's blood dripped from the cross morphs into this idea that Jews kill children, Christian children, and we take their blood and we make matzah. Now, how did that connection get made? This idea that Jews take blood of Christian children and use it to make matzah, maybe, just maybe, it's because of a link to 4 cups of wine that we drink at Passover time, right? 4 cups of wine, red wine. Maybe that red wine is actually blood, which, by the way, is part of a Christian tradition in the transfixiation of the blood of Christ coming from Jesus. The wine that the priest pours becomes actual blood of Jesus. And so all of these traditions morph together, and we see the Jews then being accused of killing children for their blood. And the first example of it came in the 12th century. I mentioned his name earlier. Thomas of Monmouth accuses the Jews in his town of torturing a little boy named William, who's found dead in the forest. And there are literally hundreds of examples of Jews being accused of killing children for this reason, even into the 20th century. Last century, in the last 100 years, we still have examples, even in modern world America, of Jews being accused of the blood libel. Now that evolves over time and ultimately becomes what we know of as modern anti-Semitism. And as I said in the subtitle, it is a new twist on an old story. The father of anti-Semitism, who coined this term, anti-Semitism, is a man named Wilhelm Marr. In 1873, he, a German political agitator, wrote a book called The Victory of Judaism over Germanism. He was a nationalist of sorts who believed that Germany deserved better than what the Jews were bringing. And his thesis was that the Jews themselves were conspiring to run the German state and should be excluded from citizenship. This right here is the very first example of a man using Jewishness to exclude Jews from their rightful place in a community. That evolves over time into some really terrible literature being written. You've probably heard of this before, but let me talk for a moment about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In Russia, a secret police document was written and collected and became known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which talked about a secret plot by rabbis around the world to take over the world. Take a look at these 2 pictures here. First of all, on the right, notice that this is an American version. And this one here shows a Jew who looks sort of like a monster hovering over the globe, blood dripping from his fingers as he takes over and controls everything. And here, a few more examples. My head is covering a copy of the book from Japan. Above me, right above my head, a book with a spider that is a Jew controlling the entire world. The middle on the top, a snake, the Jewish conspiracy. The left-hand side, a snake with a Jewish head, large nose, makes us look like an animal or a bug. These are the pictures that are used on the cover of this famous book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which talk about that secret plot. And let's be clear, this is something that has not gone away. Look at Pizzagate, just in the last couple of years, which implicated Jews and Democrats and others in our own modern community of having similar kinds of plots against the world, against our country. So these ancient tropes of Jews being monsters or devils or blood-sucking, bloodthirsty bugs or creatures become codified and part of the story of our people. There's also something called social Darwinism that begins to take shape with the world of Darwin's scientific discoveries. Now, this is not Darwinism in the truest form. This is not Darwin's idea of natural selection. This is instead racism. mixed with anti-Semitism that suggests that Jews are somehow less than other people. We are the undercurrents of the universe. We are what needs to be trampled upon because of others' racial superiority and our inferiority. This is the basis, social Darwinism, of ultimately what drives the Nazi regime and the awful atrocities of the Holocaust. Now, in 1894, there's a famous story that I just want to talk about for a moment because it will begin to transition our conversation about anti-Semitism to Israel. In 1894, there was an event called the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jew and a captain in the French army, was accused and then convicted of selling military secrets to the Germans. It was a lie. He was falsely accused and falsely convicted. And evidence was actually discovered, but it was covered up by French officers who wanted to blame this crime on a Jew. Because, of course, Jews should be blamed for everything. Now, Dreyfus ultimately was vindicated, but the Dreyfus Affair, as it became known, showed us just how deeply these ancient tropes had been embedded in European culture. Now, there was somebody watching the Dreyfus Affair, a man by the name of Theodor Herzl, who ultimately writes a book about why the Jews need to find their way to a new land to avoid this anti-Semitism. He said, basically, if it can happen to Alfred Dreyfus in France, then it can happen to anybody. And we need a new land, Alt Neuland, a new old land. And he was eventually the father of Zionism. Unfortunately, it was not to happen for another 50 or 60 years. And in that interim time, some terrible atrocities were portrayed against the Jews. In Russia, mostly, and in the rest of Eastern Europe, the Jews themselves were extremely poor, but they were blamed for all of the problems in the Russian community. Pogroms or terrible insurrections against communities were instigated by Tsarist secret police. One such happened in 1905 and 1906 in a small town named Kishinev. Kishinev was among the bloodiest of the pogroms, where every Jew in the town was rooted out and killed in the streets. And then between 1917 and 1921, more than 500 Jewish communities in the Ukraine alone were wiped out in pogroms. 60,000 people were killed in these terrible and terrifying moments. Another example. This is from a book written in 1932 called The Poisonous Mushroom. It's a children's book, and that is the picture on one of the pages. The Jew sitting on top a bag of gold. Look at him. Despicable human being, that Jew. Now let me read to you from the text. The God of the Jews is money. To earn money, he commits the greatest crimes. He will not rest until he can sit on a huge money sack, until he has become the king of money. The Jew is quite indifferent when the cheated non-Jew goes hungry. Jews have no pity. They strive for one thing, money. They do not care two hoots how they get it. The Jew is not a person like us. The Jew is a devil. A devil has no sense of honor. A devil deals only in the meanness and crime. It goes on and on. A children's book devoted to demonizing Jews to be something demonic and terrible. And all of this leads, as we know, in the modern world to the Holocaust. I don't want to talk a lot about the Holocaust because we've all done our own work in Holocaust education, but I do want to read you this statement from the Vatican. There is no better statement to explain the atrocities of this time in our history. Written on March 12th in 1998. This century has witnessed an unspeakable tragedy which can never be forgotten. The attempt by the Nazi regime to exterminate the Jewish people with the consequent killing of millions of Jews, women and men, old and young, children and infants, for the sole reason of their Jewish origin, were persecuted and deported. Some were killed immediately, while others were degraded, ill-treated, tortured, and utterly robbed of their human dignity, and then murdered. Very few of those who entered the concentration camps survived, and those who did remained scarred for life. This was the Shoah. And that brings us to where we started. Dr. Barr, a survivor himself of the Holocaust, made the decision to support Israel education because Israel is, in fact, the answer to this anti-Semitism, at least on one level. Unfortunately, as you're going to see in the remainder of this class, Israel becomes the target of anti-Semitism next. So before we move on to the next slide, I just want to take a moment and ask if anybody has any questions or comments thus far. You can unmute, you can tell me anything you need. Any questions? Nothing.
Actually, I have a question. I'm sorry, my screen's not working.
No problem, Stacy.
Yeah, I'm wondering if anti-Semitism has been more prevalent in some communities more than others, and if it has to do with like the presence of Jewish communities, if people know Jews among their neighbors and friends, are they less likely to be anti-Semitic? So or is there no particular relationship between the presence of Jewish communities and anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think it's less. This is an unscientific answer to your question, but my best educated guess, and actually Rabbi Marla might want to chime in as well, is that there isn't really a relationship to the interconnectedness of Jewish communities. What there actually probably is a better corollary is the economic and social welfare of the community. It seems that in times that social welfare is going down, that economies are going down, there is a tendency to blame someone. And because the Jews have been an age-old, to-be-blamed people, it's easy to retreat back into some of the tropes that I mentioned in the first part of the class. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Rabbi Mara, do you want to add anything there?
Not really. I would say that in places where communities have built relationships between the Jewish community and other communities, I do think there's less anti-Semitism. When people have personal relationships, except if you were to, go back to Germany, for example, neighbors were friends and still they turned on each other. So I think it really depends on what the greater societal reality is. So like in Germany, I'm not sure that was so true, but in modern times, when we look at communities where relationships are built between, say, churches and synagogues and that kind of a thing, much less so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that's a great way of understanding it.
No, I just want to say I tend to agree, because I think when you are in a community that they don't know any Jews there, then they are very easily go back to the old stereotypes of what you've mentioned before, the horns, the money hungry, grabbing, all the stereotypes.
I think you're right, with one exception, that it's often not, it's more with curiosity than it is with negativity, right?
Yeah.
So there's a wonderful story of Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the first Reformed Jew in America, who was living in Cincinnati, and a woman heard that there was a Jewish man living in Cincinnati who was the leader of the Jews. She got in her horse and carriage and drove from Columbus, Ohio at the time, down to Cincinnati to meet this Jew. She walked around him 3 times. And she said, "My, you are no different than any other human being." And so it wasn't that she thought there was something terrible about him. She was just looking for his horns. She didn't understand. And so I think being in proximity of a Jewish community that's thriving, that's positive, that's social justice minded, often can solve the problem.
Yeah, no, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. I was in my past in an area that didn't know any Jews, and when they found out I was Jewish, they were like, "Wow, you're Jewish?" And I'm like, "Yep, no horn, no tail. Here I am.
I'm just a normal person," right? Yeah, for sure.
Right.
For sure. Okay, I'm going to move on because I don't want to lose time to deal with this. I want to just talk a few other things that happened more recently. For those of you who are my age or older, you probably remember 1978. The Nazis wanted to march in Skokie The document behind my head is the letter that they wrote and posted on placards, on signs and posts around the Skokie community outside of Chicago. Ultimately, they won a court case allowing them to march in Skokie. And it was one of the free speech cases that has really sort of we've struggled to deal with it, because it leads then to things like this. So if I can make this work, maybe, I don't know how it works. I can't do it. I'll have to figure out how to do it later, but I do have a recording here of in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rallies, where people were walking down the streets. Richard Spencer, the leader of one of the white right supremacist movements, chanted things like, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." Again, just takes us to the next step of where we've been. So all of this leads us to anti-Zionism. Here we are transforming this conversation about history, how anti-Semitism has grown and built over the course of time. And this is a wonderful quote from the great scholar and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. "Once I thought that anti-Semitism had ended. Today, it is clear to me that it probably never will end." And the reason he said that was because of what he saw going on in Israel. Specifically, I'm talking about an organization or a movement called BDS, or Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. I want to talk a little bit about what the BDS movement is. It aims to emulate a campaign from the 1980s that was working against South African apartheid. Now, the people who support BDS suggest that Israeli-Palestine policies are, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, are like apartheid. And that the same tactics that were used to demand apartheid to be ended and dismantled should be employed to pressure Israel today. So if you go back in time, in the 1980s, boycotting and divesting from South Africa was a very common political tactic to try to get the politics of South Africa changed. And so the idea of using that same concept against Israel has been employed by the BDS movement. But I want to say loudly and clearly, the BDS movement, as we understand it today in America and around the world, is anti-Semitic. Because many of the founding goals of the BDS movement, including denying Jewish people a right of self-determination, are anti-Semitic. Many people who are involved in the BDS campaigns are driven by one thing, by opposition to Israel's existence as a Jewish state. And we're going to go a little bit further to help us understand exactly what this looks like. These are real quotes from people who claim to be supporters or leaders in the BDS movement. "Jews are not a people." This is from Omar Barghouti, who's the co-founder of the movement. Jewish Voices for Peace, another Jewish organization supporting BDS, says that Zionism is a false and failed answer, a settler colonial movement establishing an apartheid state, creating a racist hierarchy. And then this one from NYU students, part of the justice movement at NYU. "We are not going to let them stand by and support Zionism. Our point is to make being Zionist uncomfortable on the New York University campus." And lastly, from the grand wizard himself of the KKK, David Duke, "The Jews are trying to destroy all other cultures as a survival mechanism. And the only Nazi country in the world is Israel." These are words spoken by supporters of the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement. It doesn't sound like a solution to the Palestinian-Israel problem. It sounds like an accusation of Jews as not having a right to exist. Here are their demands. First, the bullet point from their website. BDS demands an ending of the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, and dismantling the wall. My question, which lands are they talking about? Gaza, the West Strip, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights. In exchange for what? Taking down a wall that is keeping people secure just to take it down? The next point on the BDS website, they want to recognize the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. Now, my response, full equality for Arab citizens in Israel would require overturning and amending Israeli laws that grant Jews automatic citizenship and define Israel as our nation state, a nation state for the Jewish people. So this idea of recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab citizens to full equality in Israel actually would be the end of Israel as a Jewish state. Next, on their website, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. So if we were to do that, granting a right of return to Palestinians who are classified as refugees, these would mean the original refugees and millions of descendants. It would be the end of the Jewish state and a Jewish majority. But on their website, they say BDS is an inclusive, anti-racist, human rights movement that is oppressed on principle to all forms of discrimination, and including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But I'm saying that BDS on their website offers no solutions. Jews should leave, Jews should stop oppressing Palestinians, but no solutions to the conflict. It doesn't seem to me that that is anything political. It seems to me that that is only anti-Semitism raging. So how do we respond? How do we deal in our communities and on the college campus to the BDS challenge? First of all, I want to introduce what's known as the 3 Ds test. This is a test to determine whether somebody's comments are in fact anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, or appropriate political dialogue. First of all, is the comment delegitimizing Israel's right to exist? In other words, is the comment or the statement or the argument suggesting that Israel has no right to exist as part of the world map? If so, it doesn't pass the test. The second, does the comment demonize Israel or Jews? In other words, are we monsters? Are we somehow like the devil, as in the tropes that we saw in imagery prior? And lastly, is it a double standard compared to other nations? In other words, if we're talking about behavior that is oppressing people, then the same organization should be speaking about oppression in places like Myanmar and Ethiopia and other places around the globe, not simply one country and one issue. And if it doesn't pass that test or any of the 3 Ds, then it is anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. Now let's go a little bit deeper and deal with some of the myths that you may hear. This is the practical part of my conversation tonight. First, Israel's apartheid wall is a violation of international law and must be torn down. Here's the reality. Countries have the right to protect ourselves. Even in America, we have the right to protect ourselves against invasions from other people. Nobody can deny that a security barrier in Israel has saved lives. Bombers who came across those lines prior during the Intifada have been stopped. And the High Court in Israel has held that the barrier is legal and has issued rulings to alter the route where it was not appropriate in the world community. So the myth that Israel's apartheid wall is a violation of international law is simply not true. The next myth, we have to allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. First of all, there's no basis for a right of return for Palestinians. Israelis from every party in Israel agree that Israel would simply cease to exist as an independent Jewish state if 4.5 million Arabs, few of whom have ever been in Israel proper, were allowed to move to Israel. Israelis, however, do agree with the United States that refugees should be allowed to immigrate to a future Palestinian state in either Gaza or the West Bank or both. The next myth: the blockade on Gaza violates international law and is meant simply to make Palestinians suffer. The fact, first of all, blockades are legal under international law. And the current blockade is not just an Israeli blockade. It is also an Egyptian blockade. So this can't be something argued against Israel alone, and yet BDS says it is only an Israeli issue. There are no BDS protests against Egypt and Egyptian policies, only against Israel. Israeli policy is the source of the Arab-Israeli conflict. If Israel wanted, the conflict could end tomorrow. First of all, it's an entirely backward statement. Terrorism has shaped Israeli policy. Israelis are protecting lives, not the other way around. Israel has repeatedly offered opportunities for peace, and in every case, they have been responded to with denials of reality. Today, even in today's government, which is not a particularly peace-forward government, there is a statement of peace negotiations that would establish a two-state solution with an Israeli state and a Palestinian state side by side. But it has never come to reality because the Palestinians have not agreed to any terms of the negotiations. Myth: Israel treats Palestinians the same as Black South Africans under Afrikaans government. We talked about that earlier. I just want to make a quick, really important statement down here at the bottom. Palestinians from the territories are allowed to work in Israel. They receive similar pay and benefits to their Jewish counterparts. They are allowed to attend schools and universities. Today, currently, 12 non-Jews, Arabs and Druze, are members of the Knesset. And there is an Arab who serves on the Supreme Court. No such opportunities were possible for South African Blacks. The parallel to the Afrikaner government and apartheid are simply false, not acceptable. Myth: Israel is an occupier of the West Bank. Well, this one is a little bit confusing because, in fact, Israel is occupying the West Bank and parts of Israel. But according to the Israel reality after the Oslo Accords, they gave up power of control of the West Bank and Gaza. And since 2005, Israel has withdrawn completely from Gaza. So this idea of occupation is a complex issue. This one is not a falsity in its entirety, but it is a very complex understanding. And to suggest that Israel is just an occupier or a colonizer is just not fair. So what are the facts? And how are we going to deal with them tonight? BDS represents a very, very hostile delegitimization tactic that rests on one fact. Israel either has the right to exist or does not have the right to exist. Israel either is allowed to defend themselves or not allowed to defend themselves. BDS doesn't do anything to promote peace between Arabs and Jews. BDS simply tries to delegitimize the idea that Israel has a right to exist as a country in the world. I think that a more constructive way of living would be to promote peace initiatives, for example, to talk about a two-state solution, to talk about building of a future. This is something that BDS doesn't ever do. And it needs to be named out loud on the college campus. If you approach somebody from a BDS campaign and they talk about Israel as an occupation force, you need to ask the BDS representative what their solution for peace looks like. I'm telling you, they will not have one. And that is a red flag in the conversation. Now, Israelis on the ground want peace. An overwhelming majority of Israelis argue that there is support for a two-state solution. Israelis in the government, out of the government, on the streets, want to find a way to improve the situation on the ground. They want to end this idea of delegitimizing Israel and punishment of Israel. And they want to stop undermining the commitment to a two-state solution that's happening by organizations like BDS. Again, ask the person that approaches you on the street who is a BDS supporter, what is your solution? If they have none, then that is a suspect reality. Recognize, though, that this is a complex conversation. Holding Israel alone accountable for the conflict just isn't fair. It's not true. Everybody has to take ownership of their part in what's going on. Is Israel at times wrong? Of course. And if you read Noah Tishby's book and hear her speak later in the year, you'll understand that there is more than one Arab population to be spoken about. There are Arab Israelis who are living inside the land of Israel. There are Arabs, Palestinians living in the West Bank, and there are Palestinians living in Gaza Strip. Those three stories are entirely different. They're entirely separate and can't be lumped together as an Arab-Israeli problem. It is complex. It can't be resolved overnight. And we have to ask for bringing people together on both sides of a negotiating table for anything to happen. BDS and the anti-Semites of the world who are anti-Zionists refuse at a first step to even have a conversation. Simply, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, and that is the end of the conversation. And for me, that is an identification of the flaw in their reasoning. And Israel is a proud democracy. If you look at what's happening on the ground in Israel, Israel has leadership from Arabs, from Jews, from Christians, from people of all walks of life. And this indicates that it is a thriving democracy that we don't see in other Arab nations, or the Gaza Strip, or the West Bank. And so to take those non-democratic entities and put them up against democracy as a potential solution to the problem is just not fair and just not a reality. So I'm asking you to push back against depicting Jews as dominating finance or the media or controlling governments. I want you to push back against denying the legitimacy of the state of Israel. I want you to ask people not to apply a double standard against Israel, criticizing Israel for policies that are ignored in other nations. I want us to push back against using the Holocaust or other anti-Semitic imagery to be a critical force against Israel. We have to stop demonizing Israel and its Jewish citizens. We have to stop portraying Jews as white Europeans who are coming in to colonize. We have to stop assigning Israel responsibility for all of the violence and allow both sides to take responsibility for their implications in the reality. And we need to stop denying the rights of people in Israel to exist, to defend themselves, and to live peacefully in a future. If we do all of this, then in the end, we will have successfully moved ourselves out of this anti-Semitism into a pro-democratic, pro-peace movement that I believe is the future for Israel's continued success. And before I turn off the slides and then go to just questions and answers, I just want to make a note here. At the bottom of the screen, you see that Temple has a landing page, templeisrael.org/Israel. This is our landing page for all things Israel programming throughout the year. We'll be adding programming to this listing throughout the year, and I hope you'll continue to be engaged and be a part of the conversation of Israel at the Crossroads. So with that, I'll stop sharing and allow all of you to ask any questions that you might have for me. Joe.
Rabbi Josh, I just wanted to say how amazing that presentation was and how insightful it was on so many different things, and overwhelmed with what an amazing job you did. And also, I know Rabbi Marlowe's on the call here, and Randy Sack was on the call, and all of this came together with a lot of help from a lot of people, and I am just overwhelmed with the clergy help, Rabbi Marlowe and what she's done, Kendra Smolash, and all the other clergy. You guys are amazing, and I'm really excited about this.
Thank you. That wasn't a question.
I have a comment. Oh, Randy has a comment too. So
Go ahead, Marilyn. Go ahead.
recently somebody talked to me about the concept of colonization. And when you define, I don't have a dictionary definition of colonization in front of me, but it's when some outside power comes in and takes over control of the land. And it was a kind of a new way of talking about Israel in that context, because they use the term that the Israelis, the Jews, are the indigenous people of the land. We are far from being the colonizers. The Jews were the people who were there first. And over the centuries, different countries have come in and colonized, but they've always been there. And it was just a very different way of looking at it, because people look at Israel as this first world, very successful startup nation, high tech company, that because of all those things, it must be the colonizer. But the reality is they're the indigenous people. And I thought it was a really interesting and different way of looking at that term.
I thank you so much for sharing that. As I was preparing for this class, and I spent a lot of time this last couple of weeks reading and gathering material, this notion of colonization comes up often in a lot of the websites. And one of the reasons for it, Rabbi Marla, is because the modern state of Israel was in fact created by the series of aliyot, of movements from Eastern Europe to Israel, beginning at the end of the 1800s and all the way up until the Holocaust, by primarily white European colonizer types, if that makes sense. And so at a time when colonization was happening, remember, France colonized Beirut and Lebanon and Syria. England colonized Palestine and Egypt. So what colonization was happening at the time when these European whites came in to reestablish what you described as the autonomous indigenous people of the ancient Near East. Well, that was a intellectual problem for somebody who is an onlooker, right? If you don't see history in its entirety and go all the way back to where I did of Abraham going and leaving his land and being told by God to go to this new land, then you only see a small snippet. And it is, if you only see from 1850 to 2000, then you do see colonization. But if you see it in terms of 2,000 or 3,000 years of history, you can't see colonization. So the question is, can we see history in this much, or do we have to see history in this much or beyond? So really a great comment. Thank you so much for raising that. Randy.
My question is, first comment, thank you for taking something that is so hard to put into succinctness that you really actually did and really framed something. And I look forward to the PowerPoint because it's just going to make so much more sense by being able to look at it. With that, you talk about BDS and JVP, very easy to see. They're not shy about supporting it. They talk apartheid, all sorts of. There are some other groups, though, that are more disingenuous in what they put out there. I'm looking at one right now, an email that I saw. They don't talk about BDS. They'll claim that they don't support BDS, but yet they are using the terms apartheid, etc., and everything else. Are they still lumped in that anti-Semitic camp? Is that too difficult to talk about here because it's so confusing? I don't know, but
yeah,
you have to offer for that.
I appreciate you asking the question. I purposely stayed away from naming specific groups or organizations because I didn't really want to get into the politics of groups. But let me give you an example that may be something just for everybody on the conversation to hear. J Street, for example, is clearly by their website and by their doctrine opposed to BDS, right? They're anti-BDS. And yet they agree that using strategies of boycott, divest, and sanction is an acceptable political process. So the question that you're asking is, can you take the anti-Semitism out of the BDS policy? In other words, the demonization, the denying Israel's right to exist, and the sort of the anti-Israel rhetoric, out of it and use something like boycotting or divesting from or sanctioning an organization or an institution or a country as a policy. So let's talk about it loudly and clearly. What has the United States done against Iran with regard to the nuclear deal? Sanctions. So sanctions are a politically acceptable tactic, as long as it's not done in concert with demonization and delegitimization. So the problem with BDS is not the idea that they're offering the idea, let's sanction Israel, let's deny Israel the right to, let's boycott Israel. If it was just a political tactic to get the Israeli administration to change behavior, then it might be acceptable. We could agree or disagree whether that's good or not, but it would be acceptable. The problem with BDS is where I started. It is anti-Semitic. It doesn't pass the 3 Ds test. The sanction of Iran does not demonize Iran, does not demonize Iranians. It does not delegitimize Iran from being able to exist on the map, right? Nobody's saying Iran should be wiped off the map, but sanctions are being used to change politics. That's a very important distinction to be made. And so there are organizations like J Street who say, if you believe that boycotting would actually make a difference, that might be an acceptable stance, but we don't accept BDS because it is an anti-Semitic organization. Does that make sense?
It does, but to extend it, what about using the words apartheid? Is that to be construed?
I think apartheid is a real problem. I mean, I hope I was clear today. What's happening in Israel is not apartheid. It just doesn't fit the definition. I don't know how, I don't think we have to go beyond that, because you can't have a Palestinian member of the Supreme Court in a country that is behaving in an apartheid state. It's just not real. So to have that conversation is just disingenuous. And by the way, if you meet anybody on the street who uses the word apartheid, undress them with the arguments that I gave you tonight and tell them they're just wrong, because definition-wise, it doesn't work.
Because that's what they're hearing on these college campuses, and which is the unfortunate reality today with the college kids, as you well very know, you're so entrenched in it, is that the conversation changes and the words change, and I think it's used to confuse, and the kids are at a real disadvantage because it is all changing, the rules are all changing, and but it's really good to hear this, and I think that this really can help a lot of us, but help a lot of kids hopefully in the future to stand up for.
It's late in our conversation for me to add another concept, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's a concept called intersectionality. The idea of intersectionality is if we have a common enemy or if we have a common friend, then we're on the same team. And that's happening a little bit, right? So when people talk about apartheid, it is sort of tied into this whole idea of anti-racism. Right? If we're really anti-racist, then we are anti-apartheid. And anything that sounds like it's racist, we should put out there as an apartheid. It's not exactly fair. It is happening all over. This intersectionality is linking people who probably shouldn't be linked, but are finding connections in mutual enemies or mutual issues. And I think the word apartheid has been grasped onto by many of those intersectional organizations because it's just an easy word to throw out there. But definitionally, it's wrong.
Thank you for that. I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, this is sort of in the same vein, like Israel as a political state and actual individual politicians in Israel that, how, sort of understanding the space to talk about politicians' policies, sort of like current events, and have a certain conversation about those and keep it separate from anti-Semitic ideas and anti-Israel ideas. Like, how can we have productive conversations about sort of Israeli politicians that are separate from being pro-Israel or anti-Israel and,
Right. Thank you. That's a great question. Let me start off by maybe answering in a way that is closer to home for people who live in the United States of America. Let's talk about American politics. It's a little bit easier and safer, although talking politics ever is not particularly safe, so I have to be very careful. But you may agree with the Build Back Better bill in Congress, or you may disagree. And you may like a politician who supports it or dislike a politician who supports it. But no matter what, if you live in the United States of America and you participate in the American political process, you likely like America and believe that America has the right to exist and that America and our democracy should thrive. Is that a fair statement? I think the same rubric needs to be put on Israel and Israel policy. I am not proud to have my last name shared with the current Prime Minister of Israel. We don't agree politically about anything in Israel, but that doesn't make me or give me the right to be an anti-Israel advocate. So there's a difference between identifying a person's political beliefs and implicating the entire people of Israel and or the Jewish people, right? People can disagree, agree about American politics and still agree that we are all Americans and we love America. If we stop doing that when talking about Israeli politics, then I think we're missing an opportunity to engage in what democracy offers us. To suggest that somebody is anti-Israel because of their political state or political ideology in the Israeli government, it's not fair. They were elected by a democratic process in Israel, right? As an outsider to that democratic process, I have only one right, and that is to learn, to grow, to understand, and to do the best I can to support. I think what you're suggesting is that oftentimes politics in Israel gets mixed up with this racist or anti-Semitic ideology, whereas politics in other countries doesn't enter into the realm of racism or anti-Semitism. And I think that's exactly the point of this whole presentation tonight, right? We cannot allow people to convolute anti-Jewishness or anti-Israel anti-Semitism and call it political thought. That's not okay. And the moment somebody turns politics into racism or anti-Semitism, then it's out of bounds. And I would stop the conversation. I would tell somebody, if you're going to talk about that policy as an racist or a anti-Jewish policy, we can't have the conversation anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it definitely gets mixed up in like anti-Israel. Like, can you be supportive or non-supportive of Israeli leadership or an Israeli policy or an Israeli politician, and are you still pro-Israel if you're not happy with certain things Israel's doing? I think that's a helpful answer, though, to think about policy and politics crossing the line into being sort of pretending as though all of the Jewish people stand behind everything that every Israeli politician says and does.
Well, let me give you an even better, I'm a sports guy, so let me give you a modern American sports analogy that it works for me. You watch a football game. I went to the University of Illinois. Where'd you go to school?
Michigan.
Great. Or terrible. I don't know, whatever. So you went to Michigan. You're sitting in the big house. You're watching a Michigan football game, and your team fumbles the ball and loses the game. You stand in the crowds and you scream terrible things about the Michigan coach or quarterback, right? That's what Michigan fans do. Does that mean they hate Michigan? No, they love Michigan. And being a Michigan fan gives them the right to argue vociferously when things go badly. But in the end of the day, they love Michigan. And there's one example that I want to share that is a proof of the other. Sometimes that Michigan fan goes over the line and writes a death threat to the quarterback or to the coach. And suddenly that fanship has crossed that line and it no longer is in fair bounds for what it means to be a fan of a team or a sport. So cheering for your team when things are going well and being disappointed and angry at your team when things aren't going well, that's all part of loving your team. But asking for the demise of your team or its coaches or its players or its people, that's outside of bounds. I hope that helps.
I like that one.
Only a Michigan fan understands that. So. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left. Any last questions before we sign off? So first of all, thank you again to the Miriam and Dr. Isaac Barr Israel Education Fund at Temple Israel. This is going to be a great year of programming. Please go to temple-israel.org/Israel to continue to be up on what's happening. In the spring, please join us to be with Noah. God willing, she'll be with us in person and able to celebrate and teach us. And if you haven't read her book, it really is worth picking up a copy. Temple Israel has information about how you can get copies, and we are so excited to welcome her. It is the most easily digestible, understandable book about Israel and Israel policy that's out there right now. So please enjoy. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope you learned. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much
you.
for this.
And on behalf of my father and the Barr family, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Good night, everybody.